Well, we have spent the morning learning about incredible applications of AI. I have been amazed to see what you all are all doing here at Stanford. But now we're going to shift to talking about responsible use of AI. And in doing so, this sounds like a bit of a doomer threat, preventing AI-driven threats to human health. But before we go forward, I want to do introductions here. My name is Griffin. I am a tech reporter with Bloomberg News. This subject is near and dear to my heart. I covered the pharmaceutical industry and national security and health security before moving out to the Bay to write about AI. And I'm going to pass it to you, and we can do introductions one by one.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kim Branson. I lead AI for GSK globally. I have a background. Many years ago, I wanted past a medical school, but I ran away very quickly and did a PhD in machine learning back in the dark ages in the early 2000s, and have been doing that sort of thing ever since.
I'm David Magnus. I'm here at Stanford. I'm a faculty member in the departments of Pediatrics, Medicine, and by courtesy of Bioengineering. And I'm an associate dean of research. And I've done a lot of research on a range of issues related to AI, and including some issues related to AI and misuse of AI.
And I'm Lynda Stuart. I'm the CEO and president of a new foundation called the Fund for Science and Technology. Prior to that, I was the executive director working alongside David Baker at the Institute for Protein Design. And prior to that, I was in vaccine R&D, both at the Gates Foundation for 10 years, where I led their discovery program and pandemic response, and as the VP of Infectious Disease at BioNTech towards the end of the pandemic.
Thank you, Lynda. A title like this can let the imagination go wild. And so I want to situate us in reality for a moment and ask each of you briefly, what is one AI-driven health threat that you think is here today or is so near term, around the corner, that it is worth examining right now?
I guess the closest thing we have as we start to build AI models for prediction of pandemics or looking at circulating flu strains, your favorite pathogen, and deciding whether they're going to escape, herd immunity or be drug resistant, things like that. Those models, which can be built, you can obviously use them a great deal used to design things, because you could hook it up to a generative process. You've heard about that today, and use it as a fitness function to score things, right? So that's a real threat that exists right now. And I think interestingly, a lot of this data is currently open, so you could build your own. And a lot of the models that are out there are currently opened. They're on an MIT license and things like that. So there are these sort of systems out there today. I would say, however, I don't think we're seeing people doing that, but that is a realistic scenario right now.
Yeah, it's a tough one because there's a lot out there. I do have similar worries to Kim. I would say one other worry that's maybe something I hadn't really been thinking about until very recently, changes in society, the way in which there's been a lot of effort to build models to help make AI more fair and to worry about biases that exist. In the wrong hands, those could be tweaked to make AI less fair. And that would not be very hard to do. And we now know that there are a lot of different parts of society that have interests in building a less fair system. And so I'm very worried about that in the short term.
It's hard to follow those two. I think those are all pretty existential threats. Before I talk about what could be bad, I always want to be balanced and say there's many, many things that could be good, so we shouldn't get too doom and gloomy in this. I think a real just in the AI biodesign world that is true now is it is possible to circumvent some of the DNA synthesis screening tools that we have in place to capture people who are trying to make toxins or other poisonous agents. And I think there are tools now that could be used to try and bypass that. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes trying to circumvent that, but I think that is a real current and present concern.
What I love about having the three of you here as panelists all together is that we have representation from industry, academia, philanthropy, foundations. I want to start with industry. You mentioned the ability for AI to help prediction of variants, to help with drug discovery. At GSK, how are you thinking about securing the kinds of tools that aid with this work so that they don't get misused?
Yeah, so we have existing models right now that we build for predicting next strains for basically for flu and COVID and other aspects. It's not to say there aren't those sort of models out there in the public domain. There are. What maybe makes our model slightly different is we have our own sort of pathogen surveillance data as well, which may become increasingly valuable over the next couple of years. And so that model is probably a higher performance than maybe some of the public models. We use it for internal efforts. We don't plan to release it. But obviously we have a good process in charge for logging who's using it, what we're using it for, and securing it. But there is also a benefit to giving it to our collaborators and things like that. And so that's something we want to wrestle with. Well, how do you actually release these models in a way that allows other people to use them? But then what if someone copied it or stole it from a lab or something else and it goes into the public domain? How do we think about that from a liabilities perspective and all those sorts of things? So we're sort of thinking about how to sort of thread that particular needle. Right now, I think the performance isn't so great. But you can see a world where that's going to shift very rapidly as we throw more compute and have more data at it. So I think that's where we're struggling these sorts of things. We're thinking kind of categorizing models on like low potential for dual use to very, very high potential for dual use. So if you have a model that can only really do one thing, it predicts pathogen strains, it doesn't do anything else, like that's very easy to just tip it the other way. But if you have a model that's more like a general LLM, you could ask it about pathogens. It's probably nowhere near as good as the particular pathogen prediction model. So we say it's like a level 1 model, for example. And those are ways we think of categorizing it, but there isn't really the equivalent of BSL safety for models in biology yet, right? That have high or low dual use potential.
David, we've heard a lot about highly specialized bio-design tools here today, but Kim just mentioned some of these consumer-friendly and facing tools, LLMs like ChatGPT, Claude. How do you think about creating recommendations for the more consumer-facing models that everyone is using?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Obviously, that's a different kind of misuse where patients misuse it because they have too much confidence in something that's not that they shouldn't have confidence in. But I actually think taking a step back, as we're releasing things to the public, we need to start to think upstream in the development process of how we can mitigate some of those risks so that they don't wind up leading to all these problems downstream. And there's a couple of things that can be done for that. One that's very hard to scale, but it's something that we've been doing at Stanford. HAI, for all of their grants, has something called, and all the Raise Health grants have gone through the same process, an ethical societal review process. A lot of people are under the assumption that things like IRBs, institutional review boards, review for all issues that arise. They don't. They're very narrowly focused on the risks to research participants, which means downstream consequences are outside the scope, and actually under the US regulations, IRBs are prohibited from thinking of downstream consequences as risks of the research. And so having an ethical and societal review where you consider those downstream consequences up front and figuring out mitigation strategies, I think is critical to making this happen. Well, we've got evidence. We published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showing that this actually has an impact on the design process and that those mitigation strategies really can work to make a difference. But it's very, very labor intensive, and so we need to figure out ways of building that up to really make it scalable. And then the second thing that's part of that, which helps avoid the scalability problem, is giving researchers the tools to, for themselves, think through what are the things that they can do to actively mitigate the potential downstream consequences and have a framework for thinking about that. So we just published a paper in Nature Machine Intelligence a handful of months ago. I can't remember exactly when it came out, a few months ago. That really gives a framework for researchers for how to think about different dimensions of risk mitigation strategies, when they're needed, when they're not needed, and how to think about that as a way of avoiding some of these problems.
Can I just follow on? So one of the things as a funder, I also think about my funder hat on, is that there is a lot of interest in increasing capacity to do AI and do biological infectious disease research for the necessity of being able to respond to pathogens and pandemic preparedness and so on. And in that context, there's actually now been established something called the Biofunder Compact, where all funders of this type of work internationally are actually doing those types of downstream reviews, really understanding what are the biosafety capabilities of the organizations they're supporting, and also thinking about how they are responsibly using AI for benefit and trying to mitigate risk. So this is now becoming quite sort of embedded in a lot of ways people are funding more broadly.
And Lynda, as you think about embedding these checks and balances, how do you ensure that you're doing so without slowing the innovation of the entities you're funding?
So I think this balance of innovation and responsibility is super complex. I just co-chaired the National Academy review of life sciences and the biosecurity risk of that. And in that review, we actually put forward this need to adopt an if-then framework. And what that allows you to do is to have a sort of regulatory and governance framework that is adapting and keeping pace with the innovation. And so as an example, you can make, you don't put in place a regulation because you don't know when you're going to need that regulation. But you can say, if the capability emerges that you could do something, then these are the actions that you should put in place. But since none of us know in this very, very fast-moving ecosystem when something is going to become possible, we're not over-regulating it prematurely, but we are being responsive to the emergence of that capability. So I think those types of creative governance and regulatory frameworks really are required to balance allowing and enabling innovation, but also making sure as it evolves, it's responsibly used.
I was going to say, the thing that doesn't really concern me isn't academics or people being funded, because mostly they're going to behave in the right way. It's actually, honestly, other groups and nation-state actors and others that can pick up these models and use them, and they do have the resources to buy computation. The cost of computation is coming down, and that, I think, is really probably what we're more concerned about than those who behave in the right way in the system. It's very difficult to know how to mitigate that, though.
Well, that's why our approach was to try and figure out ways in which you can try and build some things into the process, at least as much as is possible. It won't eliminate the risk, but really deterrence is all about making it so that it's easier to do something else bad besides using your models, right? So if you make it so that there's, and there's lots of things that you can do, whether depending on the technology and the potential misuse. Maybe for some things watermarking, for other things it might be having more control over things. But you build things in, again, they can all be gotten around, but you make it harder to do, and it's easier to do something else. So state actors have, we know Russia had huge football stadium-sized anthrax facilities. So we knew they had that. So, but as you're thinking about these AI models and what they can be used to create these potential bioweapons, if you make it hard enough, they can just build anthrax. So that's probably sad, but that's probably the best we can do is figure out in advance ways of creating systems of deterrence.
And I think making it very easy to do the good things, right? Very easy to generate medical countermeasures, very easy to access those tools for epidemiology and surveillance of pathogens and so on. If we kind of lean into the good and we mitigate on the bad, I think that balance is really important.
The Soviet era bioweapons threat looks a lot different than the one we're talking about today. And Kim, you mentioned affordability, accessibility. A lot of these tools are getting cheaper. Are we moving quickly enough to compensate for how cheap some of these lab tools, DNA synthesis tools are becoming?
I guess there's nothing stopping you from, right now you were talking about, detecting things. Well, you can evolve a better anthrax toxin that probably doesn't look from a frequency analysis anything like a previous one, maybe. And you could send it off to have your DNA synthesized. What's interesting is you can buy a DNA synthesizer, you can buy a protein synthesizer. I was at an event the other weekend in San Francisco. There's all these people making neuropeptides and inject themselves or RNA and doing this sort of stuff right now. And, if you lurk on the right subreddit forums, you'll find people doing this sort of stuff and are trying to apply these tools. So there are maybe a small fraction of cases, but that is out there. Are we going to start to say that like DNA synthesis and having a lab at home is a restricted thing? It already is, right? You're supposed to adhere and log this sort of thing. So I don't think those sort of things stop people. But I think it's really as these systems spread out, I think you just have to hope that it's probably more access to data, I think, is really going to be the way we measure things. And that's really the way we've controlled a lot of things with, the data we have in medicine right now, is you have to say, well, I want this data, so what I'm going to use it for. And then we check to make sure you're using the right thing. And when you don't need any more, you have to, destroy the data and show that. I think that's probably the way we'll have to control things, not by access to the compute or the hardware to make it, but by the raw data.
Can I just say I'm usually the voice of gloom and doom, and I can't believe, Kim, you're topping me in this. So, but I do think it's important to first. I mean, the record is good so far, right? I mean, we haven't had some of those abuses. I agree. I'm worried about those same risks, but I also think the point that we want to try and figure out the good as well. And just like we have an obligation to mitigate the bad, we have an obligation to enhance the good as we're thinking about the balance between those two things. And in a way, we are all making a gamble that when all is said and done, the good is going to outweigh the bad. As long as those are informed choices where people are thinking through. The worry I've got is when people aren't thinking about things downstream and they're just saying, I'm not going to worry about mitigation because that's in the application, that's downstream. And then the next step says, that's downstream, I'm not going to worry about that. And by the time you get downstream, they say, well, if way back when people had thought about this, right? So as long as people are thoughtful in advance, start to think about these things, and we are prudent in the way we do things, I'm actually hopeful that maybe we can avoid disaster while also being prepared for nature producing things that are also bad.
Yeah, I mean, nature can do bad things, right? So we should think about that, and it's more likely to be nature than anything else, some chicken or something. I think one other point to make is I think one of the reasons that these tools, these dual-use tools, have not been effectively deployed in a bioweapons context is biology is actually very, 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 very difficult to engineer. So, I mean, the beautiful talks that we saw from in that life science session kind of spoke to everything that we can do, which is amazing, but the vast amount that we cannot yet do. We can't really engineer a cell. We probably, to completely engineer a new replicating virus or self-replicating organism, we're not there yet. And it would be easier just to kind of pull anthrax out of a pocket than to probably try and do that, at least at this point. So I think holding on to the complexity, or being realistic, as a biologist, I'm realistic about the complexity of biology, which is why we love it and keep us in our jobs for a long time. But it probably is not, we're not yet able to easily engineer it for bad.
Kim, we all have blind spots, and there are folks of many different disciplines in the room. Not every AI expert has a background in bio and vice versa, and we haven't even touched the policy debate. How do you ensure that folks of different disciplines are thinking about risks holistically?
Yeah, I think part of actually thinking about that process is how, I guess, I started working with David in the first place. So GSK funds these AI ethics fellows, and we sort of observed early in the machine learning community that we had, and it was very similar to what nanotech had. These people come in and worry about grey goose scenarios, and then there's a whole bunch of people working in the community saying, look, I'm just trying to move carbon with my scanning tunneling microscope, dude. I can't make a self-replicating anything. Well, we had a lot of legal folk came in the AI community, and they had all these different ideas and risks they were talking about, but the technical people just ignored them because they were so far off what was practical at the time. But what was different is we could see the rate of change was very different. And so thinking instead, well, why don't we take people who have a technical background now and train them in bioethics and trying to have that so they can then do research on these things from that aspect to be getting ahead was a way of doing these sorts of things. I think the community has been fraction of the community are heads down just building and just so excited by what we can build, improving on the benchmarks and that sort of thing. And there hadn't really been until recently in the last 2 or 3 years, another part of the community saying, actually stop, maybe we should think about that. And then we started people thinking, look at the bias in LLMs, all these different types of things, and realizing, as we had a hunger for more and more training data, in early days, we were filtering out quality data sets. Eventually, it was like, no, just throw all the tokens in, right? And we went to that kind of phase. So I think now we've got this emerging part of the machine learning community now doing a lot of active research on that, and I think that's actually really, really useful. So we are seeing all the rest of that community coming in. I think today is a good example of that. But I think we need to do more of a job of actually it does matter. You do need to know how these things work to some extent, right, to really have an input into it. And I think that's also really important in the design of things. Rather than saying, well, I think it should behave like this in these scenarios, that's great. But like someone's like, well, how are we going to make it do that, right? How does that reduction to practice work? And that's why I think we need those disciplines coming together.
Here we're imagining AI-made bioweapons, but there are lots of different AI kinds of threats. And David, you mentioned misinformation on ChatGPT. What about surveillance? What about misinformation?
Yeah, sure. We're certainly worried about a wide range of ways in which AI could be misused. And I think that's the broader term rather than dual use. Dual use has a very technical meaning in the regulatory system in the EU, something that has both civilian and military applications. So we usually like to think of it as, I think in the EU, they refer to this as reasonably foreseeable misuse. So so there are lots of ways in which AI can be reasonable to foresee potential for misuse. For surveillance, ambient technology, which has been mentioned a little bit earlier, is great, and it makes it possible for people to put things in people's homes that predict when they're at risk of falling and when we need to intercede to stop them and make them safer. There's similar kinds of things that study how people walk that are sometimes used at rehab centers as they're evaluating people, and getting elderly people to not fall is a really important part of geriatrics. But it turns out people's gaits are individuating. And so that means the same wonderful models that have all these incredible great uses can also be used to identify mass protesters and who they are by repressive regimes who want to identify protesters. So that's just one of many, many examples.
And Lynda, I want to ask you to put your pandemic preparedness hat on, because you've talked about the ways that AI can be used for medical countermeasures. Right now, we're seeing an administration defund some of the pandemic preparedness efforts and roll back some of those programs. How does that fit into this broader conversation of the regulatory environment? And what support would you like to see from the government to aid both pandemic preparedness work, but also AI threat prevention?
I'm not going to comment too much on the defunding of certain things besides saying, it is important, I think, that we are prepared, and it's unfortunate if that is being undermined. I think to be truly prepared, what you need is a system where all of the pieces of the puzzle are in place, all of the agreements are pre-existent, and that you are therefore ready to be able to stand up an effort. And so you need your epidemiology and your surveillance systems linked into companies like GSK that have good vaccine R&D, linked into manufacturing that can happen at scale, and you need that all to be deployable. And in every step of that process, AI has an ability to absolutely change the game. So both in how we look at surveillance data, how we design new vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics, how we actually manufacture things, I think that's going to be a transformational piece. And then actually, what is the most reasonable, rational, and effective way of rolling out an intervention? So AI can play a game across all of that. And I think just making sure we have those pieces buttoned up would be what I would recommend.
And Kim, we've kept this conversation pretty U.S.-centric, but at GSK, this is a global pharmaceutical company with a footprint near and far. You're thinking also about the UK and the EU. How does the regulatory environment there look different from here?
With respect to AI?
Yeah, with respect to AI safety.
I think as you sort of go from the US to the UK to the EU, you get more restrictive with the EU AI Act, which I think a lot of people are realizing that for us it was an act that people created, and then it was like, okay, well, what are the regulations? How do we implement? What are the guidelines? That still is a process. I think that we've sort of seen from the current administration that maybe they're concerned that maybe California or different states will start to regulate and create their own acts around AI, and they don't want that to happen. And I think they believe that we should be sort of free to let things run a little bit. I think there'll be cases where we decide that's not appropriate and that's appropriate. I think the UK is going to take a sort of a middle of the road where they realize it's something they can lean in from an economic perspective and everything else. You've got great examples like DeepMind and others, and University of Edinburgh is one of those places which kept a lot of things, during that great AI winter. They've got great data sets as well that they're really trying to work through how to push on that. I think they will see some economic benefits. And I think as we go to the EU, there's a lot more, depending on which states, there's a lot more concern and fear and like a wait and see attitude. And like we rolled out, I guess it was a while ago, a tool at GSK we deployed, which allows people to sort of, read all the scientific research, so not just summarize a paper, but say, we'll put a question in, reason over all the papers, find me something, distill these topics out. And I was at a senior leaders thing recently where I had sort of this interesting experience where 1/3 of my science was like, this is amazing, I can do so much more stuff, this is fantastic. And I had 1/3 of people, which I'll call like this sort of sad, disappointed, resigned folks, were like, I used to like doing that, like reading all the papers. That was like the fun thing I did on Fridays, and it's better than me. I'm like, well, it's okay, you could still do that. It's coming up with a good question. And then there was this 1/3 that were like, actually, no, we shouldn't do this. We should stop and write. What if it hallucinates, everything else? And it was very interesting that 1/3 were predominantly from, I wouldn't say which sites, but they were more predominantly from our European sites. So there's an attitude there. And I think they were more concerned, well, what if we make a decision? What if we do this stuff? How we check this stuff? I couldn't possibly check 200 papers in an hour. So they're legitimate concerns. And I think a lot of those concerns are actually, well, how do you know it's robust and reliable and that sort of thing? So I think that's what we're seeing as you go across those regimes right now.
With just a few minutes left on this panel, I want to make sure that the room has an opportunity to ask any questions. So please raise your hand and ask for the mic if you have questions about AI threats and solutions. We've got one here in the front. Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Russ Altman from Stanford. Could you comment on open source? Open source has been an unabashed good thing for many people, not everybody. But then I think open source becomes more complicated. I'm talking about open source data and open source code when you start thinking about the kinds of threats you've been discussing. So do we have to rethink open source?
I think you kind of do. So I guess the thing that concerns me most, I don't know if people have, there's this great paper called Sleeper Agent LLMs, where I think it was made by the Anthropic guys put it out, where they show that you can effectively train an LLM that bypasses all the safety stuff. So it looks like behaves correctly in your safety evaluations and everything else. Then you can feed it a sequence of tokens and have it behave in a very different way. Right? Now, I don't want to make everybody paranoid, but there are a whole bunch of open source LLMs from different places out here floating around that people are using, right? And there's no way you can tell, at least not in the public domain right now, that these have these sort of properties, right? And you can't exhaustively push all the token sequences through it and find that out. So that becomes a very different thing. You can bake and you can leak information through these things as well, right? So from an information security perspective, I could bake in the GSK secrets in there, fine-tune it, release my model out there and pass to the outside world. Like that's something we've thought about that from an information security perspective. And so that means, I think before, when it was code, it was artifacts, you could verify it, you could run it, was very easy. Data, we knew how to secure data and you can look at versions of data sets and things like that. But when you've got a trained artifact that's released, and obviously we publish our models, if it's a model published in public data and we didn't spend millions of dollars computing it, we'll put it out there for everyone to use. If it's on public and private data, we won't release that model, for example, and private data, obviously not. But there's a scenario, if these models come out there, how will you check, right? It's very difficult now. And I think that's something that where maybe, we're running a bit ahead there, but I think open source also will be the solution to solving that problem as well, very much. So I don't think there's any reason to abandon open source. I think it's been a net good thing. Llama, all those sorts of things have allowed a lot of people to build and play with a lot of things fast and everything else, so.
I would say just like everything else, it's about trade-offs, right? So depending on the particular model and depending on the particular data sets, some of them, making them open may be dangerous, and so they might be born classified, as it were. And then there are others where, in general, the presumption should be making everything open, though. I think that the bar should be pretty high before you decide to build paywalls. But that's also raises, there may be other issues having to do with commercial interests, proprietary interests, that also will play a role. But if you leave those, aside from those, from a biosecurity point of view, I think the bar should be pretty high before you'd want to draw that line.
I'll tell one salutary tale, which I thought was an interesting story, which was during the recent Mpox outbreak, there were a couple of vaccine people who were trying to develop a vaccine and antibodies against Mpox, and they were trying to access AF3 to fold, the structural proteins on the cell surface to see whether they could dock antibodies. And they couldn't because, of course, Mpox looks a lot like smallpox, and it was censored during, they were just testing, censoring access to that. But it happened to actually slow down a genuine, public health emergency of concern response by 3 weeks while the investigators were trying to access that tool. So that's just it was an interesting. It was Reno Rapuli who's the.
Did they use OpenFold instead and just get on with their day?
There were other sources of good models, but anyway, those are things that can happen, right? You can slow down the bad guys, not just the good guys. So I think it's always this balance.
We started this panel asking about what's an immediate threat that you're thinking about. Now I want to know, what is an immediate solution you'd like to see implemented? Kim.
To biosecurity?
To biosecurity, some of the threats that you've identified, regulatory environment, what do you think could help shore up protection now?
I think that the first thing is to train people, when you have a wide community that has a code of ethics and code of ethics and practice that sort of looks down these sorts of things, and I think does a bit of self-policing on who it transfers information or helps and aids is probably the best way to do these sorts of things. I don't think, sure, you can lock down data, but there's so much data in the public domain that only solves the new things coming out. I think that's probably the solution, is to have more of a community that decides that this is not something we're doing, and responds in that way.
David?
Wow, you just totally stole my thunder. Yeah, I think the same thing, that the key is really going to be about building systems where researchers far upstream are thinking about the downstream consequences, building ethics into their approach, building mitigation strategies, and thinking about how to optimize the use. It doesn't help people if you're building tools that look great on paper, but all the obstacles to actual implementation are there, so it's not going to actually produce anything worthwhile. So, yeah.
Lynda?
So I'm overwhelmingly enthusiastic about the opportunity that AI brings to health and healthcare and drug development and everything. And I think if you do the calculation of what is the net benefit going to be, like how much faster can we discover drugs to cancer? How much faster can we cure autoimmunity disease? Or how much better can we reach into patients who would otherwise be marginalized? That net benefit is so positive that the small downside risk that something funky might happen is really where I kind of lean into the positive, and really think that there is so much opportunity for what we can do that's good, that we really need to get very, very excited about that and make sure we maximize the positive and not get so caught up in the negative that we fail to do that.
Well, thank you for thinking about this in such a nuanced way, and for paving the way for the innovation that we heard about earlier today. Please welcome me in thanking our panelists.
Okay, that's really great panel, and we hope that everyone here has gotten a lot out of today's conversation. We want to have a couple announcements. One is stay connected. If you haven't already signed up for our Raise Health newsletter, you can find it on the website. If you want to also contact the team, you can reach out to them to keep the conversation going. We appreciate your engagement today, your engagement online. I know it's always hard online to stay engaged, but I know you did it, so thank you.